Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. John Gotti. John Gotti was an Italian-American gangster who became boss of the powerful Gambino crime family in New York City. Gotti and his brothers grew up in poverty and turned to a life of crime. At an early age, Gotti quickly rose to prominence, becoming one of the crime family's biggest earners, and a protégé of Gambino family underboss Aniello Dellacroce, operating out of the Ozone Park neighborhood of Queens. The FBI indicted members of Gotti's crew for selling narcotics, and Gotti took advantage of growing dissent over the leadership of the crime family. Gotti feared that he would be killed along with his brother and best friend by Gambino crime family boss Paul Castellano for selling drugs. So he organized the murder of Castellano in December 1985 and took over the family shortly thereafter. This left Gotti as the boss of the most powerful, richest, and largest crime syndicate in the world, one that made hundreds of millions of dollars a year. From construction waste management, hijacking, loan sharking, labor unions, drug trafficking, bookmaking, labor racketeering, prostitution, extortion, pornography, numbers racket, illegal gambling, and other criminal activities. At his peak, Gotti was one of the most powerful and dangerous crime bosses in the world. During his era, he became widely known for his outspoken personality and flamboyant style, which gained him favor with some of the general public. His peers avoided attracting attention, especially from the media, but Gotti became known as the Dapper Don for his expensive clothes and personality in front of news cameras. He was later given the nickname the Teflon Don, after 3 high-profile trials in the 1980s resulted in his acquittal, though it was later revealed that the trials had been tainted by jury tampering, juror misconduct, and witness intimidation. Law enforcement authorities continued gathering evidence against Gotti that helped lead to his downfall. Gotti's underboss Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano is credited with the FBI's success in finally convicting Gotti. In 1991, Gravano agreed to turn state's evidence and testify for the prosecution against Gotti after hearing Gotti on wiretap making several disparaging remarks about Gravano that implicated them both in several murders. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of 5 murders: conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, illegal gambling, extortion, tax evasion, and loan sharking. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole and was transferred to United States Penitentiary Marion. Gotti died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002 at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. According to former Lucci's crime family boss Anthony Gaspar Picasso, what John Gotti did was the beginning of the end of Cosa Nostra. Early life. John Gotti was born in the Bronx, New York on October 27, 1940. While his parents were both born in the U.S., his ancestors came from San Giuseppe Vesuviano in the province of Naples. He was the 5th of the 13 children of John Joseph Gotti Sr. and John Sr.'s wife Filomena, and one of 5 brothers who became made men in the Gambino family, Eugene. John Gotti was initiated before John due to John's incarceration. Peter Gotti was initiated under John's leadership in 1988, and Richard V. Gotti was identified as a capo by 2002. The 5th Vincent was initiated in 2002. Gotti grew up in poverty. His father worked irregularly as a day laborer, and indulged in gambling. As an adult, John Gotti came to resent his father for being unable to provide for his family. In school, Gotti had a history of truancy and bullying other students, and ultimately dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at the age of 16. Gotti was involved in street gangs associated with New York City mafiosi from the age of 12. When he was 14, he was attempting to steal a cement mixer from a construction site when it fell, crushing his toes. This injury left him with a permanent limp. After leaving school, he devoted himself to working with the mafia-associated Fulton Rockaway Boys gang, where he met and befriended fellow future Gambino mobsters Angelo Ruggiero and Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson. Gotti met his future wife Victoria De Giorgio, who is half Italian and half Russian due through her mother, in 1958. The couple were married on March 6, 1962. They had 5 children: Victoria, John, Frank, Angela, and Peter. Gotti attempted to work legitimately in 1962 as a presser in a coat factory and as an assistant truck driver. However, he could not stay crime-free, and by 1966 had been jailed twice. Associate. As early as his teens, Gotti was running errands for Carmine Fatico, a capo in the Anastasia crime family, which became the Gambino family following the murder of boss Albert Anastasia. Gotti carried out truck hijackings at Idlewild Airport together with his brother Gene and friend Ruggiero. During this time, Gotti befriended fellow mob hijacker and future Bonanno family boss Joseph Massino, and he was given the nicknames Black John and Crazy Horse. It was around this time that Gotti met his mentor and Gambino underboss Aniello Dellacroce. Dellacroce regaled Gotti with tales of past mafia glories under Albert Anastasia, leading Gotti to adopt Anastasia as his role model. In February 1968, United Airlines employees identified Gotti as the man who had signed for stolen merchandise. The FBI arrested him for the United hijacking soon after. Gotti was arrested a third time for hijacking while out on bail 2 months later, this time for stealing a load of cigarettes worth $50,000 on the New Jersey Turnpike. Later that year, Gotti pleaded guilty to the Northwest Airlines hijacking and was sentenced to 3 years at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. Prosecutors dropped the charges for the cigarette hijacking. Gotti also pleaded guilty to the United hijacking and spent less than 3 years at Lewisburg. Gotti and Ruggiero were paroled in 1972 and returned to their old crew at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, still working under capo regime Carmine Fatico. Gotti was transferred to management of the Bergen crew's illegal gambling, where he proved himself to be an effective enforcer. Fatico was indicted on loan sharking charges in 1972. As a condition of his release, he could not associate with known felons. Gotti was not yet a made man in the mafia due to the membership books having been closed since 1957, but Fatico named him the acting capo of the Bergen crew soon after he was paroled. In this new role, Gotti frequently traveled to Dellacroce's headquarters at the Ravenite Social Club to brief the underboss on the crew's activities. Dellacroce had already taken a liking to Gotti, and the two became even closer during this time. The two were very similar, both had strong violent streaks, cursed a lot, and were heavy gamblers. Carlo Gambino, nephew Emmanuel Gambino, was kidnapped and murdered in 1973, and John Gotti was assigned to the hit team alongside Ruggiero and Ralph Gallione for the main suspect, gangster James McBratney. The team botched their attempt to abduct McBratney at a Staten Island bar, and Gallione shot McBratney dead when his accomplices managed to restrain him. Gotti was identified by eyewitnesses as a police Bergen insider and was arrested for the killing in June 1974. He was able to strike a plea bargain, however, with the help of attorney Roy Cohn, and received a 4-year sentence for attempted manslaughter for his part in the hit. After Gotti's death, he was also identified by Joseph Massino as the killer of Vito Borelli, a Gambino associate killed in 1975 for insulting Paul Castellano. Captain. Gotti was released in July 1977 after 2 years imprisonment. He was subsequently initiated into the Gambino family, now under the command of Paul Castellano, and immediately promoted to replace Fatico as capo of the Bergen crew. He and his crew reported directly to Dellacroce as part of the concessions given by Castellano to keep Dellacroce as underboss, and Gotti was regarded as Dellacroce's protégé. Under Gotti, the Bergen crew were the biggest earners of Dellacroce's crews. Besides his cut of his subordinates' earnings, Gotti ran his own loan sharking operation and held a no-show job as a plumbing supply salesman. Unconfirmed allegations by FBI informants in the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club claimed that Gotti also financed drug deals. Gotti tried to keep most of his family uninvolved with his life of crime, with the exception of his son John Angelo Gotti, commonly known as John Gotti Jr., who was a mob associate by 1982. In December 1978, Gotti assisted in the largest unrecovered cash robbery in history, the infamous Lufthansa heist at Kennedy Airport. Gotti had made arrangements for the getaway van to be crushed and baled at a scrap metal yard in Brooklyn, New York. The driver of the van failed to follow orders. Rather than driving the vehicle to the scrapyard, he parked it near a fire hydrant and went to sleep at his girlfriend's apartment. The NYPD recovered the getaway van and lifted the fingerprints of several perpetrators of the robbery, helping to unravel the Lufthansa crime. On March 18, 1980, Gotti's youngest son, 12-year-old Frank Gotti, was run over and killed on a family friend's mini bike by a neighbor named John Favara. Frank's death was ruled an accident, but Favara subsequently received death threats and was attacked by Victoria Gotti with a baseball bat when he visited the Gottis to apologize. On July 28, 1980, he was abducted and disappeared, presumed murdered. The Gottis were on vacation in Florida at the time, but John Gotti is still presumed to have ordered the killing, an allegation dismissed by his daughter Victoria. Gotti was indicted on 2 occasions in his last 2 years as the Bergen capo, with both cases coming to trial after his ascension to Gambino boss. In September 1984, Gotti was in an altercation with refrigerator mechanic Romuald P. Sick and was subsequently charged with assault and robbery. In 1985 he was indicted alongside Dellacroce and several Bergen crew members in a racketeering case by Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Giacalone. The indictment also revealed that Gotti's friend Willie Boy Johnson, one of his co-defendants, had been an FBI informant. Taking over the Gambino family, Gotti rapidly became dissatisfied with Paul Castellano's leadership, considering the new boss too isolated and greedy. Like other members of the family, Gotti also personally disliked Castellano. Castellano lacked street credibility, and those who had paid their dues running street-level jobs did not respect him. Gotti also had an economic interest. He had a running beef with Castellano on the split Gotti took from hijackings at JFK Airport. Gotti was also rumored to be expanding into drug dealing, a lucrative trade Castellano had banned. In August 1983, Ruggiero and Gene Gotti were arrested for dealing heroin based primarily on recordings from a bug in Ruggiero's house. Castellano, who had banned made men from his family from dealing drugs under threat of death, demanded transcripts of the tapes, and when Ruggiero refused, he threatened to demote Gotti. In 1984, Castellano was arrested and indicted in a RICO case for the crimes of Gambino hitman Roy DiMeo's crew. The following year he received a second indictment for his role in the American Mafia's commission. Facing life imprisonment for either case, Castellano arranged for John Gotti to serve as an acting boss alongside Thomas Bellotti, Castellano's favorite capo, and Thomas Gambino in his absence. Gotti meanwhile began conspiring with fellow disgruntled capos Frank DeCicco and Joseph Joe Pineamone, and soldiers Sammy Gravano and Robert Di Bernardo to overthrow Castellano, insisting despite the boss's inaction that Castellano would eventually try to kill him. Amone's support was critical, as a respected old-timer who dated back to the family's founder, Vincent Mangano, he would lend needed credibility to the conspirators' cause. It has long been a hard and fast rule in the American mafia that killing a boss is forbidden without the support of a majority of the commission. Indeed, Gotti's planned hit would have been the first off-the-record hit on a boss since Frank Costello was nearly killed in 1957. Gotti knew that it would be too risky to solicit support from the other four bosses since they had long-standing ties to Castellano. To get around this, he got the support of several important figures of his generation in the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. He did not even consider approaching the Genoveses. Castellano had especially close ties with Genovese's boss Vincent Shin Gigante, and approaching any major Genovese figure could have been a tip-off. Gotti could thus claim he had the support of off-the-record contacts from 3 out of 5 families. He could also count on the complicity of Gambino consigliere Joseph N. Gallo. After Dellacroce died of cancer on December 2, 1985, Castellano revised his succession plan, appointing Bellotti as underboss, to Thomas Gambino as the sole acting boss while making plans to break up Gotti's crew. Infuriated by this and Castellano's refusal to attend Dellacroce's wake, Gotti resolved to kill his boss. DeCicco tipped Gotti off that he would be having a meeting with Castellano and several other Gambino mobsters at Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985, and Gotti chose to take the opportunity. The evening of the meeting, when the boss and underboss arrived, they were ambushed and shot dead by assassins under Gotti's command. Gotti watched the hit from his car with Gravano. Several days after the murder, Gotti was named to a 3-man committee to temporarily run the family pending the election of a new boss along with Gallo and DeCicco. It was also announced that an internal investigation into Castellano's murder was well underway. However, it was an open secret that Gotti was acting boss in all but name, and nearly all of the family's capos knew he'd been the one behind the hit. He was formally acclaimed as the new boss of the Gambino family at a meeting of 20 capos held on January 15, 1986. He appointed his co-conspirator DeCicco as the new underboss while retaining Gallo as consigliere. Crime boss. Identified as both Paul Castellano's likely murderer and his successor, John Gotti rose to fame throughout 1986. At the time of Gotti's takeover, the Gambino family was regarded as the most powerful American mafia family with an annual income of $500 million. In the book Underboss, Gravano estimated that Gotti himself had an annual income of no less than $5 million during his years as boss, and more likely between $10 and $12 million. To protect himself, legally, Gotti banned members of the Gambino family from accepting plea bargains that acknowledged the existence of the organization. Gotti maintained a genial public image in an attempt to play down press releases that depicted him as a ruthless mobster. He reportedly would offer coffee to FBI agents assigned to tail him. The Teflon Don. Gotti's newfound fame had at least one positive effect. Upon the revelation of his attacker's occupation and amid reports of intimidation by the Gambinos, Romuald P. Sick decided not to testify against Gotti thanks to Bosco Radonich. The Yugo and the head of the Westies in Hell's Kitchen Manhattan had the right connections. When the trial commenced in March 1986, he testified he was unable to remember who attacked him. The case was promptly dismissed, with the New York Post summarizing the proceedings with the headline, "I forgot Gotti." It was later revealed that Gambino thugs had severed P-Sykes' brake lines, made threatening phone calls and stalked him before the trial. On April 13, 1986, Dellacroce was killed when his car was bombed following a visit to Castellano loyalist James Fiala. The bombing was carried out by Victor Amuso and Anthony Casso of the Lucchese family, under orders of Gigante and Lucci's boss Anthony Corallo, to avenge Castellano and Bellotti by killing their successors. Gotti also planned to visit Fiala that day but cancelled, and the bomb was detonated after a soldier who rode with Dellacroce was mistaken for the boss. Bombs had long been banned by the American Mafia out of concern that it would put innocent people in harm's way, leading the Gambinos to initially suspect that Zips were behind it. Zips were well known for using bombs. Following the bombing, Judge Eugene Nickerson, presiding over Gotti's racketeering trial, rescheduled to avoid a jury tainted by the resulting publicity, while Giacalone had Gotti's bail revoked due to evidence of intimidation in the P-Sick case. From jail, Gotti ordered the murder of Robert DiBernardo by Sammy Gravano. Both DiBernardo and Ruggiero had been vying to succeed Frank Dellacroce until Ruggiero accused DiBernardo of challenging Gotti's leadership, when Ruggiero, also under indictment, had his bail revoked for his abrasive behavior in preliminary hearings. A frustrated Gotti instead promoted Joseph Armone to underboss. Jury selection for the racketeering case began again in August 1986, with John Gotti standing trial alongside Gene Gotti, Willie Boy Johnson, Leonard DiMaria, Tony Rampino, Nicholas Carrozzo and John Carnaglia. At this point, the Gambinos were able to compromise the case when George Pape hid his friendship with Westie's boss Bosco Radonich, and was impaneled as juror number 11. Through Radonich, Pape contacted Gravano and agreed to sell his vote on the jury for $60,000. In the trial's opening statements on September 25, Gotti's defense attorney Bruce Cutler denied the existence of the Gambino crime family and framed the government's entire effort as a personal vendetta. His main defense strategy during the prosecution was to attack the credibility of prosecutor Diane Giacalone's witnesses by discussing their crimes committed before their turning state's evidence. In Gotti's defense, Cutler called bank robber Matthew Traynor a would-be prosecution witness dropped for unreliability, who testified that Giacalone offered him drugs and her panties as a masturbation aid in exchange for his testimony. Traynor's allegations would be dismissed by Judge Nickerson as wholly unbelievable after the trial, and he was subsequently convicted of perjury. Despite Cutler's defense and critiques about the prosecution's performance, according to mob writers Jerry Capeci and Gene Mustaine, when the jury's deliberations began, a majority were in favor of convicting Gotti. However, due to Pape's misconduct, Gotti knew from the beginning of the trial that he could do no worse than a hung jury. During the deliberations, Pape held out for acquittal until the rest of the jury began to fear their own safety would be compromised. On March 13, 1987, they acquitted Gotti and his co-defendants of all charges. 5 years later, Pape was convicted of obstruction of justice for his part in the fix and sentenced to 3 years in prison. In the face of previous mafia convictions, particularly the success of the commission trial, Gotti's acquittal was a major upset that further added to his reputation. The American media dubbed Gotti the Teflon Don in reference to the failure of any charges to stick. Reorganization. While Gotti himself had escaped conviction, his associates were not so lucky. The other two men in the Gambino administration, underboss Armone and consigliere Gallo, had been indicted on racketeering charges in 1986 and were both convicted in December 1987. The heroin trial of Gotti's former fellow Bergen crew members Ruggiero and Gene Gotti also commenced in June of that year. Prior to their convictions, Gotti allowed Gallo to retire and promoted Sammy Gravano in his place while slating Frank Locascio to serve as acting underboss in the event of Armone's imprisonment. The Gambinos also worked to compromise the heroin trial's jury, resulting in 2 mistrials. When the terminally ill Ruggiero was severed and released in 1989, Gotti refused to contact him, blaming him for the Gambino's misfortunes. According to Gravano, Gotti also considered murdering Ruggiero, and when he finally died, I literally had to drag him to the funeral. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti, against Gravano's advice, required his capos to meet with him at the Ravenite Social Club once a week. Regarded by Gene Gotti as an unnecessary vanity-inspired risk, and by FBI Gambino squad leader Bruce Moo as antithetical to the secret society. This move allowed FBI surveillance to record and identify much of the Gambino hierarchy. It also provided strong circumstantial evidence that Gotti was a boss. Long-standing protocol in the mafia requires public demonstrations of loyalty to the boss. The FBI also bugged the Ravenite but failed to produce any high-quality incriminating recordings. 1988 also saw Gotti Gigante and new Lucci's boss Victor Amuso attending the first commission meeting since the commission trial. In 1986, future Lucci's underboss Anthony Casso had been injured in an unauthorized hit by Gambino capo Mickey Paradiso. The following year, the FBI warned Gotti they had recorded Genovese's consigliere Louis Manna discussing another hit on John and Gene Gotti. To avoid a war, the leaders of the 3 families met, denied knowledge of their violence against one another, and agreed to communicate better. The bosses also agreed to allow Colombo acting boss Victor Orena to join the commission. But Gigante, wary of giving Gotti a majority by admitting another ally, blocked the re-entry of the Bonanos and Joseph Massino. Gotti was nevertheless able to take control of the New Jersey DeCavalcante crime family in 1988. According to the DeCavalcante capo-turned-informant Anthony Rotondo, Gotti attended his father's wake with numerous other Gambino mobsters in a show of force and forced boss John Riggi to agree to run his family on the Gambino's behalf. The DeCavalcantes remained in the Gambino's sphere of influence until John Gotti's imprisonment. Gotti's son John Gotti Jr. was initiated into the Gambino family on Christmas Eve 1988. According to fellow mobster Michael DiLeonardo, initiated in the same night Gravano held the ceremony to keep Gotti from being accused of nepotism. John Jr. was promptly promoted to capo. Assault acquittal. On the evening of January 23, 1989, John Gotti was arrested outside the Ravenite and charged with ordering the 1986 assault of Union official John O'Connor. O'Connor, a leader in the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America Local 608, who was later convicted of racketeering himself, was believed to have ordered an attack on a Gambino-associated restaurant that had snubbed the Union, and was subsequently shot and wounded by the Westies. To link Gotti to the case, state prosecutors had a recording of Gotti discussing O'Connor and announcing his intention to bust him up, and the testimony of Westies gangster James McElroy. Gotti was released on $100,000 bail and was later acquitted at trial. It later emerged, however, that FBI bugs had apparently caught Gotti discussing plans to fix the jury as he had in the 1986-87 racketeering case. However, to the outrage of Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau, and State Organized Crime Task Force Chief Ronald Goldstock, the FBI and federal prosecutors chose not to reveal this information to them. Morgenthau later said that had he known about these bugged conversations he would have asked for a mistrial. 1992 conviction. On December 11, 1990, FBI agents and New York City detectives raided the Ravenite Social Club, arresting Gotti Gravano and Frank Locascio. In the back of the police car, Gotti remarked, "I bet you're 3-1 I beat this." Gotti was charged in this new racketeering case with 5 murders: conspiracy to murder Gaetano Corky Vastella, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, bribery and tax evasion. Based on tapes from FBI bugs played at pre-trial hearings, the Gambino administration was denied bail. At the same time, attorneys Bruce Cutler and Gerald Shargel were disqualified from defending Gotti and Gravano after prosecutors successfully contended they were part of the evidence, and thus liable to be called as witnesses. Prosecutors argued that Cutler and Shargel not only knew about potential criminal activity but had worked as in-house counsel for the Gambino organization. Gotti subsequently hired Albert Krieger, a Miami attorney who had worked with Joseph Bonanno, to replace Cutler. The tapes also created a rift between Gotti and Gravano, showing the Gambino boss describing his newly appointed underboss as too greedy and attempting to frame Gravano as the main force behind the murders of DiBernardo, Melito and De Bono. Gotti's attempt at reconciliation failed, leaving Gravano disillusioned with the mob and doubtful on his chances of winning the newest case without Shargel, his former attorney. Gravano ultimately opted to turn state's evidence, formally agreeing to testify on November 13, 1991. Gotti and Locascio were tried in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York before United States District Judge I. Leo Glasser. Jury selection began in January 1992 with an anonymous jury and, for the first time in a Brooklyn federal case, fully sequestered during the trial due to Gotti's reputation for jury tampering. The trial commenced with the prosecution's opening statements on February 12. Prosecutors Andrew Maloney and John Gleason began their case by playing tapes showing Gotti discussing Gambino family business, including murders he approved, and confirming the animosity between Gotti and Castellano to establish the former's motive to kill his boss. After calling an eyewitness of the Sparks hit who identified Gotti associate John Carneglia as one of the men who shot Bilotti, they then brought Gravano to testify on March 2. On the stand, Gravano confirmed Gotti's place in the structure of the Gambino family and described in detail the conspiracy to assassinate Castellano, and gave a full description of the hit and its aftermath. Krieger and Locascio's attorney Anthony Cardinali proved unable to shake Gravano during cross-examination. After additional testimony and tapes, the government rested its case on March 24. 5 of Krieger and Cardinali's intended 6 witnesses were ruled irrelevant or extraneous, leaving only Gotti's tax attorney Murray Appleman to testify on his behalf. The defense also attempted unsuccessfully to have a mistrial declared based on Maloney's closing remarks. Gotti himself became increasingly hostile during the trial, and at one point Glasser threatened to remove him from the courtroom. Among other outbursts, Gotti called Gravano a junkie while his attorneys sought to discuss Gravano's past steroid use, and he equated the dismissal of a juror to the fixing of the 1919 World Series. On April 2, 1992, after only 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gotti guilty on all charges of the indictment. James Fox, director of the New York City FBI, announced at a press conference the Teflon is gone. The Don is covered with Velcro and all the charges stuck. On June 23, 1992, Glasser sentenced both defendants to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and a $250,000 fine. Gotti surrendered to federal authorities to serve his prison time on December 14, 1992. Incarceration and death. Gotti was incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. He spent the majority of his sentence in effective solitary confinement, only allowed out of his cell for 1 hour a day. His final appeal was rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1994. On July 18, 1996, fellow inmate by Walter Johnson sucker-punched Gotti in the prison recreation room, leaving him bruised and bleeding because, according to New York's Daily News, Gotti had disrespected him with a racial slur. According to the article, Gotti, desiring revenge, offered Aryan Brotherhood chieftains David Sahakian and Michael McElhinney somewhere between $40,000 and $400,000 USD to have Johnson killed. In August, McElhinney told two Brotherhood underlings to kill Johnson if given the opportunity, according to a federal indictment charging him and 39 other gang members with murder, attempted murder, and racketeering. Johnson, however, was transferred to the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. Despite this, it was said that the Aryan Brotherhood never intended to do the hit for Gotti. Gotti is also believed to have hired the Brotherhood for another aborted hit on Frank Locascio after learning the disgruntled acting consigliere sought to kill him. Despite his imprisonment and pressure from the commission to stand down, Gotti asserted his prerogative to retain his title as boss until his death or retirement, with his brother Peter and his son John A. Gotti Jr. relaying orders on his behalf. By 1998, when he was indicted on racketeering, John Gotti Jr. was believed to be the acting boss of the family. Against his father's wishes, John Jr. pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 6 years and 5 months imprisonment in 1999. He maintains he has since left the Gambino family. Peter Gotti subsequently became acting boss and is believed to have formally succeeded his brother as boss shortly before John Gotti's death. John Jr.'s indictment brought further stress to John Gotti's marriage. Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti, up to that point unaware of her son's involvement in the mob, blamed her husband for ruining her son's life and threatened to leave him unless he allowed John Jr. to leave the mob. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer and sent to the United States Medical Center for federal prisoners in Springfield, Missouri for surgery. While the tumor was removed, the cancer was discovered to have returned 2 years later, and Gotti was transferred back to Springfield, where he spent the rest of his life. Gotti's condition rapidly declined, and he died on June 10, 2002 at the age of 61. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn announced that Gotti's family would not be permitted to have a requiem mass, but allowed a memorial mass after the burial. Gotti's funeral was held in a non-church facility. After the funeral, an estimated 300 onlookers followed the procession, which passed Gotti's Bergen Hunt and Fish Club to the gravesite. John Gotti's body was interred in a crypt next to his son Frank Gotti. Gotti's brother Peter was unable to attend owing to his incarceration. In an apparent repudiation of Gotti's leadership and legacy, the other New York City families sent no representatives to the funeral. By the turn of the century, due in large part to numerous prosecutions brought on as a result of Gotti's tactics. Half of the family's active soldiers were in prison. Portrayal in popular media. As early as 1990, John Gotti was already such a prominent mobster as to be the inspiration for the character Joey Zasser, portrayed by Joe Mantegna in The Godfather Part 3. Following his conviction, Gotti himself has been portrayed in 4 TV movies and 1 theatrical film. Another John Gotti biographical film, titled Gotti, In the Shadow of My Father, was in pre-production for a theatrical release, with John Travolta cast as Gotti. However, as of 2013, no other cast members had been confirmed. Filming finally started on the film with the working title The Life and Death of John Gotti, with Kevin Connolly as director in 2016 and ended in early 2017. The film, now renamed simply Gotti, is due to be released later in 2017. Gotti also features in the 4th episode of UK history TV channel Yesterday's documentary series, Mafia's Greatest Hits. The crime documentary series Mugshots aired an episode, John Gotti, End of the Sicilians, filmed in Sicily and Brooklyn, featuring court wiretaps and undercover footage of Gotti's mob. Growing Up Gotti, a reality show on the A, aired in 2004-2005. John Gotti has also been mentioned in various rap songs by artists such as 21 Savage, House of Pain, The Notorious B.I.G., Lil Wayne, Dr. Dre, Jay-Z, The Game, 50 Cent, Insane Clown Posse, Nas, Big L, Spice One, Rick Ross, Fat Joe, Collega, Cool G Rap, Kevin Gates, Ace Hood, and rappers such as Irv Gotti, Yo Gotti, and Teflon Don derived their stage names after Gotti. The Fun Lovin' Criminals song, King of New York, from their album Come Find Yourself, references Gotti. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?